Welcome to the second session. We've got 3 invited talks, which will be really interesting, and we have 2 papers, so 2 submitted papers that will be presented. And we also have the sponsor talk. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Raluca Scona. Raluca is a research fellow in the Dyson's Robotics lab at Imperial, and we've heard a little hint of what I think she's presenting from Andy in the previous talk. So yeah, without further ado, it's really interesting. So Raluca.
So hi everyone. I'm Raluca. Thank you very much for the invitation to this talk. So I'm a Dyson Fellow at Imperial College with Professor Andre Davison, and today I'm presenting a project on scene flow estimation with varying rigidity for a graph processor. So while this workshop is focusing on the SCAMP and per pixel processing, I would be very interested to hear your opinions on how this work could relate to that kind of processing as well. So scene flow is a motion estimation problem. More often we encounter optical flow, which tracks the 2D displacement of every pixel in an image. For example, for the red patch in the top image, optical flow would estimate its displacement along the green and blue segments in the second image. Scene flow is the 3D equivalent of this problem, where we track the displacement of each 3D point between 2 time indices. On the right, the red and turquoise point clouds represent the input. The blue lines connecting them represent the motion estimate from the flow field. In scene flow, one can estimate a 3D translation vector per point, or can also include 3D rotation. These quantities are useful in real-time robotic applications. Scene flow could be fed into a motion segmentation system that would allow the robot to differentiate between different objects in the scene based on their motion. So even if a robot hasn't seen an object before, it will still use this information to detect it and avoid collisions with it. Scene flow could also be used to decide which portions of the scene are static and should be reconstructed, and which objects are moving and could be tracked in time. So scene flow is a nilpost problem, and the rigidity of the flow field can be specified depending on the application. For example, if the task is to estimate the motion of non-rigid objects, such as people, one could implement local regularization. This would enforce that neighboring pixels would have the same motion, which would result in a continuously deforming flow field. So in this example, flow vectors on the arms are allowed to be much larger than those on the torso, so to better capture the person's motion. This could also be useful when capturing the motions of other non-rigid objects, such as curtains flowing in the wind or pillows being squished. We can also implement piecewise rigidity if we have information that the scene is composed of multiple moving rigid objects. So for example, in a traffic situation, one could estimate a single 3D transformation for each car, as these are rigid objects. Finally, the most extreme case is when the scene itself is fully rigid. So this is equivalent to visual odometry, as in this particular case, one would aim to achieve a constant flow field, which represents the camera motion itself. So to tackle these situations, different formulations for visual odometry or scene flow were developed, which are not necessarily transferable between these different scenarios. So in our work, we explore if we can bridge the gap between continuously deforming scene flow and rigid visual odometry. We propose a factor graph formulation for RGBD scene flow based on pairwise Markov random fields, where the variables are per pixel flow values and with 2 types of factors. The unary photometric factor warps 1 pixel from the first image towards the second to minimize the photometric error. We also impose 2 types of pairwise smoothing factors. Local smoothing is enforced between pairs of neighboring variables, while global smoothing is enforced for pairs of variables which are far from each other on the image plane. This is expensive to implement, but we leverage the IPU to process this in near real time. So the Graph Core Intelligent Processing Unit, or IPU, has 1,216 cores that are connected to an ultra-fast all-to-all communication fabric, which enables us to send data between these cores. So the main result of our work is that depending on how we set the configuration of the smoothing factors, the behavior of the algorithm can change significantly, meaning that the flow field will display different degrees of rigidity. Next I will describe the formulation. So we estimate a flow vector of 3D translation and 3D rotation for every pixel in an image. And there are 2 types of factors that we optimize for. One is a photometric alignment term, which warps a pixel with the estimated flow value and computes the photometric error between the 2 images. This means that if we had 2 images and a perfectly estimated flow field, we should be able to warp the first image towards the second one and have these 2 images agree almost perfectly. The second constraint we impose is pairwise smoothness. So on the bottom right, we show a diagram of our formulation. In orange, we show the variables that are estimated for each pixel. In red, we show the per pixel photometric factors. We also show green smoothness factors between neighboring variables and blue smoothness factors for variables that are far from each other on the image plane. So this particular diagram corresponds to an image with 2 rows of pixels. So in this particular example, the factor S1n would enforce smoothness between the variable in the top left corner and the variable in the bottom right corner of the image. So to go into a bit more detail about the formulation, we estimate a 6D motion for each pixel, composed of a 3D translation and a 3D rotation twist. To warp a point, we convert the twist to a rotation matrix, and then we apply this translation. We formulate a Gaussian photometric factor for a pixel with 2D coordinate xi. The measurement is the intensity value at location xi in image 0, and the measurement function warps the pixel from image 0 to image 1. We read the depth value at xi, unproject it to 3D, apply the warping, project it back to the image plane, and then read out the intensity value. So ideally, these values should be as identical as possible to indicate that the images are well aligned. Finally, in the smoothness factors, we just penalize for the difference between specified pairs of flow vectors. So we formulated everything using Gaussian terms, so we can solve this using maximum a posteriori estimation. So next I will describe our implementation. So to start, I will first describe the graph processor a bit. Yeah, so it consists of 1,216 cores, each with local memory and 6 threads. The cores are connected to an ultra-fast all-to-all communication fabric, so they can send data between each other. There are 3 phases to code execution. First, each core executes its local code using the data that it stores locally. Afterwards, all cores wait until execution has finished. Finally, data is copied between the cores through the data fabric. The IPU allows for increased flexibility in the computational structure of graphs. However, this structure has to be fixed at compile time. Therefore, we have to decide on the structure of the factor graph for our flow problem, fix it, potentially save it to file, and then we will be able to read it and reuse it as needed. So this processor is quite well designed for message passing systems. So we solve our factor graph using distributed optimization with Gaussian belief propagation. So this is an iterative solver, which consists of a few steps. First, the variables receive messages from the factors they are connected to and compute an estimate of their belief. Then they compute messages for their neighboring factors and send them. The factors receive these messages, they relinearize themselves around the current states of the variables and send messages back to the variables again. In GPB, we iterate over these steps for a fixed number of iterations. Finally, I will describe the structure of the factor graph itself. So we want to experiment with different kinds of regularization in this project. So in the first configuration, Bpflow, we experiment with local regularization only, and each variable is connected via smoothing factors to its neighbors in the up, down, left, and right directions. We use this configuration to simulate deforming scene flow. In the second configuration, Bpvo, we experiment with global smoothing only, and here each variable is connected to 6 others that are sampled uniformly at random on the image plane. With this configuration, we aim to simulate visual odometry. So I want to explain a bit why we chose this pattern in this particular case. One other option would be to have a hand-designed pattern where we could connect one variable to blocks of other variables. However, we found this induces unwanted symmetries in our flow field. So for example, if we were to connect the pixels in the top row with the pixels in the bottom row, and then continue with connecting the pixels in the second row with the pixels from the second row from the bottom and so on, we would observe that our flow field would show symmetries along the central row of pixels, and this is something we don't want. We want a flow field that is as smooth as possible. Another option would be to designate one variable as a visual odometry anchor and connect all the other variables to it. This would be inefficient as it would result in an all-to-one communication pattern. Instead, we find that uniform random sampling is a practical solution that produces a smooth and uniform flow field. So finally, in Bpflow, which stands for varying rigidity flow, we combine both local and global regularization, and each variable is connected to 4 local and 6 global other variables. In this configuration, we assume we are provided with a segmentation mask of which portions are rigid and which are non-rigid, and that we can disable regularization in a particular region by sending empty messages between long-range factors in that region. So by sending these empty messages, we can maintain the computational structure of the problem fixed while allowing for varying rigidity in the scene. So this would be the structure of the graph for a 14 by 10 pixel image, where the orange circles are the variables. The green local factors are formulated over the whole image in the case of Bpflow, and where each variable would also have global smoothing factors, as shown in blue. When mapping this graph to the IPU, we split the variables into patches and map each patch to a different tile. So in this example, the underlying grid represents the tile of a processor, and each patch of 2 by 2 variables would be mapped to a separate tile. With this, we minimize inter-tile communication, as local smoothing factors between neighboring variables can run all computation on the same tile. When distributing the smoothing factors, we split them equally between the variables they are connected to. Finally, as is commonly done in scene flow or visual odometry, we formulate our problem using a coarse-to-fine scheme. We solve for the motion field at the coarse level and use the solution to initialize flow values at the next level. So this is required to get more robustness to larger motion between images. So I will describe also how we evaluated our approach. So first, we evaluated Bpflow, the configuration that only implements local regularization, and where each variable is only connected to its neighbors. So we compare it with the primal dual flow, which is an RGBD scene flow method that is similar in some aspects to our approach. So they solve for 3D translation vector for each pixel, while enforcing that neighboring pixels should have the same value. They also implement geometric alignment, while we only implement photometric, but our system could also be extended to implement geometric alignment. So on the left, we show an overlay of 2 consecutive images for which we want to estimate flow. In the next 2 images, we show the flow fields from the 2 approaches, which display some similarities. We also evaluated the 2 approaches on sequences of RGBD images. So it is rather difficult to evaluate RGBD scene flow based on photometric alignment, as we require that the motion between consecutive images is not too significant. For this, we used image pairs from other publications on RGBD scene flow, where the authors reported reprojection error results. So we replicate this by warping the second image towards the first, using the estimated flow field, and then reporting the per pixel errors. So from these numbers, it appears that the 2 methods are performing somewhat similarly, which is encouraging, as it means that our factor graph formulation could be a viable alternative to standard methods based on photometric error and local regularization. So I would like to show a qualitative result of a Bpflow. So yeah, on the left is our input, which is a stream of 2 people moving sideways, where the motion of the camera is just very slight. And on the right, we show our flow estimation result. So next, we evaluate Bpvo, which only implements global regularization, and where each variable is connected through smoothing factors to 6 other variables that are sampled uniformly at random on the image plane. So first, we do a qualitative comparison between Bpvo and Bpflow to understand the impact of the global regularization on the flow field. We warp a given image with a known motion of 2 centimeters to the left, and we assess how much of this motion we can recover with our rigid scene flow formulation, Bpvo. So on the right, we show a histogram of the translational components of the flow field from Bpflow, which contains local regularization only, and from Bpvo, which contains global regularization. And in red, we show the ground truth motion. So these diagrams show that global smoothing collapses the flow field distribution into a much tighter distribution. So ideally, this would cause the flow field itself to collapse to a single value. But we think these are already quite promising preliminary results. So this distribution is also closer to the ground truth compared to the flow field from Bpflow. And we think this happens because variables get access to more global information through the long-range factors, which helps the optimization to converge to a more globally consistent solution. We also think this is an interesting result, as it shows that we can recover global properties such as the camera motion through only local computations. The formulation, however, requires quite smooth motion of the camera. So this image shows the typical performance of the method if the camera is moved smoothly. So it is a sequence from the TOM dataset, where we also reproject the first 100 RGBD point clouds using motion vectors that we sample from the central pixel in our flow field. So this shows, again, a result of Bpvo running on the TOM sequence, where the motion is slow in the forward, backward, and sideways direction. So we can see that if the camera motion is smooth and slow, our method can recover the trajectory quite well. However, we do see that on this particular example, we experience a slightly larger drift compared to dedicated visual odometry methods. So we also report trajectory error results on the TOM dataset. So we compare our method to two benchmark pure visual odometry approaches, namely DVO and VOSF. So both DVO and VOSF implement RGBD visual odometry based on photometric alignment, while VOSF also computes piecewise rigid flow estimates. So for our method, we report errors for motion estimates that are the average over the whole field, and for a sample flow estimate corresponding to the central pixel. So we can see that the sample flow estimate performs similarly to the average, which means that a representative motion estimate can simply be read out from the flow field without additional processing. However, our method is less accurate in this case compared to standard visual odometry methods, but we think there are things we could improve. So for example, the rotation parametrization could be improved to better mimic what is implemented in standard visual odometry methods. So standard VO normally estimate incremental motions, which they use to repeatedly warp one image towards the second and always relinearize their cost functions around 0. In our application, we are estimating the global rotation quantity directly, but we think replicating this repeated relinearization around 0 in GBP may improve accuracy and robustness to recovering large rotation estimates. Another idea we have is to vary the weight of smoothing factors depending on the stage of the optimization process. So here we will impose less smoothing at the start of the optimization to allow the solver to explore a larger part of the search space. Towards the end, we will increase the smoothness to force a globally consistent solution. Nevertheless, we think these results are promising, as they demonstrate we can capture global quantities, such as the camera motion, from only local computations. So finally, we also want to evaluate Bpflow, where we have both global and local smoothing in the same image. So in the top left, we show an overlay of the input images that we want to estimate flow for, and the flow fields estimated from Bpflow and the primal dual flow system are also shown below. So for Bp varying rigidity flow, we use a segmentation mask provided by MaskRCNN to tell us which parts of the image are moving independently. And we use this knowledge to disable global connections between variables of different classes. So in this particular example, we would disable any global smoothing between linking pixels that belong to a person and those pixels that belong to a background. So this allows us to achieve a flow field where we have strong discontinuities between objects of different classes, and also where the motion for the background is smooth. We show again the distribution of the flow field from Bpflow and Bpflow respectively. For Bpflow, the histogram again is quite broad, while the Bpflow field shows a strong peak, which corresponds to the camera motion, and the remaining broad distribution corresponds to the motion of the two people. So this is a qualitative comparison of Bpflow and Bpflow. For Bpflow, we also take a segmentation mask, as I mentioned before, and disable global smoothing between the background and the people. So we can see the motion boundaries between the people and the background are much sharper in Bpflow compared to Bpflow. The background motion, which corresponds to the camera motion, is also very smooth in this case. So regarding the runtime, the table reports how many milliseconds are required to run each level of our estimation pyramid. In total, we use 4 levels and run 10 iterations on each level. Overall, the runtimes for the algorithms are 17 Hz for Bpflow, 14 Hz for Bpvo, and 10 Hz for Bpflow, which requires the most data transition through the data fabric. So the graphs take a few minutes to compile, and afterwards they can be written to file. So reading them and uploading them to the processor takes around 1 second and is done once at the start. So to conclude, our contributions were a factor graph formulation for RGBD scene flow that we can run near real time on the IPU. The novel aspect is that we can implement global regularization through the long-range smoothing factors, which can also run near real time. We have demonstrated that we can capture global properties, such as the camera motion, from pure local computations. We have also investigated how the behavior of the algorithm changes when we change the configuration of the smoothing factors. So overall, we think this is a promising first step in the direction of distributed motion estimation. In future work, we are interested in improving BO through better rotation parameterization or by using motion priors. We are also interested in integrating motion segmentation itself in the optimization process, and also interested in methods for integrating temporal consistency, where flow estimation runs over several frames. So yeah, finally, as this is a SCAMP workshop, I will also be keen to hear your opinions on this work and on any thoughts you have on how this type of method could be related to pixel-wise computation. So yeah, thank you for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Excellent, thank you very much. Yes, please do put your questions in whichever chat is nearest to you. And I will start off with asking, so you're thinking of putting segmentation involved inside the process. I was wondering, do you think it's possible to have the segmentation mask as a probability, where you take your long connections and you include like a probability of the segmentation instead of like a ground truth assumed one? And wondering, would that improve the results, do you think, or would that just be extra computation that doesn't actually help?
I think that could help, because so in this particular project we are using segmentation masks from mask-RCNN, which are not ground truth segmentation masks really, but they could be, we could use them as like an initial guess for what the mask is. So yeah, we could maybe formulate some type of prior, maybe on the class of each pixel that we initialize. We would initialize using the maybe mask-RCNN result and try to maybe refine this segmentation using our system.
Cool. Excellent. There's one from the chat. If one had flexibility to change the connectivity on IPU dynamically, would there be a benefit to doing so at runtime?
I think so, yeah, because so I will go back to one of the slides. Yeah, so in this particular, what can happen in this particular case is, let's say, so this particular variable here, is connected to these other 4 variables. But let's say this particular variable belongs to the background and all these other 4 are corresponding to differently moving objects. So yeah, in this particular case, we wouldn't really get any meaningful data from these 4 sort of neighbors. We would be relying on our local neighbors here to constrain our motion properly. So if we could change the configuration at every timestamp, I would probably change it to enforce that like every pixel that belongs to the background is connected to pixels that are also a part of the background. And yeah, this would minimize sort of the possibility that we send kind of information that's not useful.
Cool, thank you. There's another one. It seems there is something like a chicken and egg problem to solve, in which you'd like to know where to break the edges of the factor graph at some places, but to know which edge to break, knowing the flow a priori for motion segmentation would be helpful. Have you thought about some way the graph configuration, the edges, could be dynamically changed in a factor graph BP framework that usually assumes the edges are fixed?
Yeah, so I agree, it's a chicken and egg problem, which makes the joint optimization, I think, really difficult. So I think, yeah, the way I would work on it right now is I would, for sure, I would always use the local smoothing, because we do want that neighboring pixels have similar flow estimates, and we do have these kind of robust factors that Andy presented before. So where we do have, if there is a large difference between motions in neighboring pixels, we can still sort of have this kind of cutoff. And then I think what I would try first is to do some sort of region growing on the flow field, assuming that only the local smoothing is imposed first. So I would try maybe, yeah, at the start of the optimization, maybe, but this is a very difficult problem. But so every pixel could have a different class. And then as we run the local smoothing sort of version of the flow field, we can say, okay, if pixels in a particular region have quite similar flow values, then we can collapse the class for these pixels. And as we grow those regions, yeah, if there are two pixels in a particular region and there is a long range smoothing factors between them, I would then enable this long range smoothing factor. But I agree, it's very difficult. I agree. So I think, yeah, the point that you had first, that maybe using an initial mask, that would be very helpful. I think that would probably lead to sort of more reliable and more robust results compared to trying to do it from scratch. But I think doing it from scratch is also interesting.
Yeah. Just a small question. When you have the segmentation marks, do you use that to send 0 messages for the local smoothing as well as the long range smoothing?
No, but we did experiment a bit with down weighting the smoothing. I'm just going to go here. Yeah, so in this particular example, we experimented with down weighting the smoothing between, yeah, the pixel belonging to the person and the neighboring pixels belonging to the background. But we didn't cut them off entirely. Okay.
And then, yeah, so would you think do you reckon there's a way to sort of do this asynchronously? So it sounds like at the moment, sort of, it's an all-to-all sort of everyone sends a message at the same time sort of process. Do you think there's an asynchronous sort of method to this, whereby every pixel just fires off to its neighbors as and when?
Yeah, I think that could be interesting to try. We haven't tried it ourselves. So as you say, it's exactly like that. Yeah. First, just all the variables compute their beliefs, then all the variables send messages, then all the factors compute, and all the factors send messages. But yeah, I think it will be quite interesting to send messages asynchronously. And yeah, this is something we could actually experiment on the graph processor itself. So yeah, it's something we could look into.
Yeah, if you don't mind me saying something quickly, yeah, I think there's nothing in the method that wouldn't work with an asynchronous processing resource. So yeah, if you'd imagine that the front end of this was even kind of event-like, yeah, such that each core was waiting for something to change and then would send out messages when it received something new, that could be very attractive, couldn't it? Such that when there's nothing much going on in the image, those processors kind of go to sleep and then they kind of wake up. So if you had something like an event camera front end with like a graph of processors sitting behind the pixels, which were able to kind of wake up and go to sleep, that could be a very, very efficient way of doing it. And I think that the method, yeah, would still, you know, you wouldn't have to change very much in the method for that sort of setup.
Cool. Well, thank you again, Raluca, for your excellent talk.
Thank you very much.
Now 11 o'clock, so I think it's time to move to Stefan Isler.